Kahea will be playing some of the images of the wonderful work that you're doing on the screen for us. The Women's Earth Alliance centers on women's knowledge and leadership. Your mission, if I understand correctly, is to protect the environment and end the climate crisis. Concretely, you're technically training women leaders, and that's to harness both climate and environmental initiatives while connecting them, and this is important as well, while connecting them with their peers. You say that there's a contradiction, and that's what I really liked when I read this information about you. Women are disproportionately impacted when it comes to climate disaster, yet when it comes to leadership roles, they are essentially not so much being implicated. Your association is working to change that. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me and for the question. What we've seen in the 17 years that we've worked and stewarded this alliance is that women are often those most impacted by the climate crisis because they are at the heart of our communities. They're the backbone of the communities, providing food, providing water, providing energy, caring for our children, caring for our elders. And because of all of that, when disasters strike, when the climate crisis gets worse and worse, and because of women's social positions in communities with climate change being exacerbated by with all of women's positions being exacerbated by climate change,
sure,
we see them kind of falling to the wayside. We see them honestly dying. Women are, 14% more likely to die in climate-related disasters. 80% of climate refugees are women. And because of that, and because of their position, because of they're in charge of these resources and their families, oftentimes they'll know what's best in their communities. They'll know if their community needs to change a water source. They'll know if destruction of a forest, how that's impacting, what's going to be needed. But they're not getting seats at the table. We as founding meeting in 2006, we held it in Mexico City because there was one of these big international water conferences, and the women there were not getting heard. They had a lot of grassroots women leaders there from all over the world, and they were not getting a seat at the table. Their issues were not being listened to. Their voices and their solutions were not being heard. And so they created a side event almost. 30 women leaders from 26 countries around the world
huge,
came together to create something that didn't exist, and that was a place and a resource for women. And they identified that they were unrecognized at decision-making tables, underrepresented in media, and under-resourced really in every single way. And that became the blueprint of Women's Earth Alliance to address those needs, to provide capacity building support, to provide appropriate technology, economic development training, business support, mentorship, financing and access to financing, and then this alliance, linking them with one another.
Yeah, I mean, let's stay with that, because one of the things that struck me about the alliance that you work with was this kind of groundbreaking strategy. You're not content with building a well in a village or ultimately, getting people access to loans. It's more about kind of fundamental grassroots change. Talk us through what that looks like at WEA.
It's really about wraparound support. We're looking at things holistically. We are whole people. Our challenges are whole challenges, and they need whole solutions. Providing grants is great. The grant runs out. There's a kind of a infamous story in the not-for-profit world where an organization went into a community that needed access to water. Women were walking very far to gather water, and so the organization, the charity, built a well right in the middle of the village, thinking this is going to solve the problems. They came back in a year, and nobody used the well. The women did not use the well, and when asked, they said, well, the only time we as women get to talk to one another without the rest of our community, without the men in the community kind of watching us and listening, is on these walks. That's where we provide support to one another and sisterhood. Why would we give that up? But if the organization had just asked the women who collect the water, where they could site a well, they would have cited it in a place that was actually useful for the community.
I mean, it's interesting. We've been hearing all day about the solution having to match the community in which it's offered. If it doesn't, if you're taking away women's time to talk to one another without the watchful eye of others, then it's perhaps not the best solution. There are several women's associations, initiatives in the world. Why WEA? Why was the Women's Environment Alliance so important for you, Kahea?
So I joined Women's Earth Alliance about 12 years ago. At the time, they were one of the only organizations that were looking at the gender and climate nexus, that really critical intersection of women's rights and climate change. And it's not to say, I don't say that because there was a lack of choice. I say that because there's a values alignment there. I wanted an organization that took an intersectional approach, recognizing the holistic nature of our issues and the holistic need for our solutions. And Women's Earth Alliance was that. And I also think, Women's Earth Alliance, we do not really operate on a top-down approach. The solutions that we are supporting through women's leadership aren't top-down solutions. They're from the grassroots up. And at the end of the day, I am an Indigenous woman from a isolated, climate vulnerable island community, and I am going to be accountable to that community, to my elders, to my ancestors, to my descendants, and one day they will ask me, those ancestors will ask me through the mouths of my grandchildren, what did you do to create change? And I want to be able to say, I listen to the solutions from our communities. I listen to your wisdom passed down, the wisdom that really is the only thing we have seen in our history to sustainably steward our earth and our communities. And I tried to amplify those. I tried to scale those and bring those to the world.
It's very powerful when you talk about the accountability and wanting to have an answer at what you've managed to achieve. We spoke about women being impacted by the climate crisis disproportionately. Indigenous women, as you just made reference to, are equally very, very impacted by climate change, the most severe consequences, targeting, or not targeting, but hitting, let's say, Indigenous women. In terms of kind of the transformation and how things can change, how is WEA tackling that?
A great example is our work on environmental violence. A few years ago, we were looking at not just climate change, but climate change-inducing industries, so extractive industry in North America and the impacts it was having on Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits, actually. And we were seeing that, and in sites of extractive industry, increase in crime, increase in violent crime against women, increase in missing and murdered Indigenous women, in drugs, in substance use. And so we did the first of its kind, a research report where we spent 3 years talking to community members. And I come from a legal background, so I anticipated that the solutions, the way they would want support to help addressing this, would be carceral approaches, would be changing policy, enacting legislation, updating current legislation. And while that was identified as important, what the community really asked us for was resources, a toolkit on community-based medicines and healing practices and workshops so they can educate their own community on what was going on, what environmental violence is. And so that's what we did. We worked with community members to create almost a recipe book of ways they could use plant medicines that they, in their own Indigenous communities, for healing on, water walks and at Standing Rock, for healing from trauma after sexual abuse. We had an environmental violence assessment they could take in their communities to educate their communities about environmental violence, but then also to figure out how their communities feel that they can address it. So that's an example of a really community-based solution. That was a request that came from the communities most impacted that we helped them to create.
It's a fact. Studies have shown, Kahea, that when you increase a woman's economic power, or economic empowerment, you might say, the outcome for families, for communities is colossal. Walk us through, give us concretely one of the projects that you've had a hand in that's really stuck with you throughout your career with WEA.
Yeah. So for more than 10 years now, we've worked with an organization called Women in Water and Natural Resource Conservation in Kenya. It was founded by a WEA leader named Rose Wamalwa. Her pictures are probably, this is a training she led. And she came to WEA in 2011 as a participant in one of our trainings through the Global Women's Water Initiative, and she got hands-on tools around economic development, around water sanitation, wash projects, mentoring other women's groups to create sustainable design development plans, things like that. And now she is leading our work in East Africa. And with her, we are supporting thousands of women. I think currently it's over 13,000 women we've trained with Rose and her group. And those women have gone on, for example, to launch tree nurseries because they are protecting the last tropical rainforest in Kenya. The land has been completely degraded. And so rather than just planting and growing trees in the forest, women are launching tree nurseries as an economic opportunity because all of our projects have to include some sort of sustainable livelihood component. We cannot ask communities to change, to bear the brunt of the solutions that have to happen in our world. So don't deforest, don't cut down trees for your firewood because it's bad for our climate. But then what's the solution? How are they going to access the things that they need? How are they going to make money if they're not allowed to deforest? Well, you train them. They can launch tree nurseries that can then replenish the forest, that can then sell trees and tree stands to their community members. So that's one example of women leaders creating economic opportunity, or the program creating economic opportunities for these women leaders who then, most of the time, the feedback we get from the women leaders, the first thing they'll tell us is, I was able to pay for my school children's fees for the year. Like, I don't have to worry about that for the year. The first thing a woman will do with her money is ensure her children have the things that they need. So that's one of the reasons that we incorporate that into all of our work.
Absolutely. I mean, this fight, and we've been hearing all throughout the day, this fight cannot be done alone. It needs to be a question of multi-stakeholders, their involvement in kind of creating, if you will, new regulation, adapting existing ones. It's challenging, though. Challenging, but not disheartening. What would you say?
I would say I'm stubbornly hopeful, as many of the women leaders we work with are. I've been hearing a lot of the word multi-stakeholder today, and I think the question that comes up for me and for a lot of community members is, are our communities one of those stakeholders? And I think they are, and if they are, then when we're looking at these large international schemes and bodies and conferences where decisions are being made, when we're looking at the COPs and the bonds and all these conferences where there's negotiations happening behind closed doors, how is it possible to say this is multi-stakeholder if one of your key stakeholders is not allowed in on those negotiations? So I think I'm stubbornly hopeful, and I still see the challenges, because if we don't have community involved, then that leads the way for even more challenges down the road. We're going to end up imposing state and corporate-centered solutions rather than community-based solutions. We will end up imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. We will end up having, because of that, inequity when we're implementing those solutions between for example, the developing world and the developed world. So I think those are some challenges we see. I don't think they're insurmountable. I think one of the best things we can do moving forward is to partner with communities, not just consult communities, not just check a box for consultation when we're working with indigenous communities and local communities, but to actually form deep and long-lasting partnerships with communities so that we can center their leadership and hear their solutions and hear the needs that are actually in the community. And that's pretty much the basis of what Women's Earth Alliance does.
So would your kind of takeaway message today, Kahea, be that all stakeholders need to be around the table, or that partnership is part of the path? What would you tell us?
Can I only have one? 'Cause both of those things. And also, I think, like, one of the things we always say is, when women thrive, our communities and the earth thrive. And so that would kind of be before those two sentences, I think, because it leads nicely into them.
You're right to put them in a hierarchy. On that note, Kahea, thank you so much for shining a light on the wonderful work that WIA is doing. It's a real pleasure to have you here sharing your experience today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.